On the book side of things, once I became an author and put myself in that world, I had a lot of luck. And I mentioned before, or I actually didn't mention this is sort of where my story takes a turn, is that this was the original cover for Diary of a Wimpy Kid. And you'll notice that it's a little boring, right? That's because, and it looks a little bit grown up. That's because I actually wrote these books for adults, not kids. All the time that I was writing these books, I wasn't thinking about kids, I was thinking about grown-ups and how they would like to read and look back on their own childhood. So that's how that happened. My books came out in 2007 and started out kind of slow. And the first time I ever saw my book on the shelves, it was under a sign that said, "Books for Girls." Right? And I would go to lots of book signings where no people would show up at all. One time I went to a book signing in California, went all the way out there, and only one person showed up. And I sat down next to this little girl on a bench, and I had this whole presentation to give, so I just gave it to her, which I think for her was very awkward. She kept looking over at her mother like, "Get me out of here." And then a few months later, things started to kind of pick up, and one time I went into a room and it had about 600 people in it, and I was shocked. And the first person in line threw up right next to me, and that's when I knew I had made it, when someone throws up at your book signing. So hopefully that won't happen today. So yeah, I just heard that. So something like I said, I wrote these books for adults, but they found their way to kids. And I felt a little bit conflicted about that because, Greg's not such a good kid, right? He doesn't always do the right thing. And here's a story in the first book where Greg doesn't really do the right thing. Greg is a safety patrol with his best friend Rowley, and they're assigned with taking the kindergartners home from school. And one day Greg decides to have a little fun and chase kids with a worm on a stick. And he gets caught by Mrs. Irvine, who thinks he's Rowley because he's wearing Rowley's coat. And she says, "Rowley Jefferson, the principal is going to hear about this." And Greg doesn't fess up. He says, "Yes, ma'am." And then that night, Greg is really troubled trying to figure out what to do about this. Should he take the blame, right? So his mother catches on to this and she says, "It's our choices that make us who we are, and you need to make sure you do the right thing." So Greg thinks about it and realizes that the right thing to do is to let Rowley take one for the team this time around. Rowley has to apologize to these kids. Greg goes home that night. Greg actually first says, "I guess this has been a learning experience for both of us." He says, "Rowley, you've learned to be careful about who you lend your coat to," right? Yeah. And then so Greg goes home that night. His mother says, "Did you do the right thing?" And Greg says, "Yeah." And Greg gets rewarded with ice cream, right? And that's the end of the story. Greg hasn't really learned his lesson, but he thinks he has. He thinks he's really, done the right thing here. And that's why I think Greg, I feel a little bit conflicted about him. I think you guys need to know that he's not a good role model, but I think it's a lot of fun to see all his faults. And so I wanted to tell you my biggest hope is to be a storyteller like Judy Blume. Have you guys read Freckle Juice or Tales of a Fourth Grade Nothing? Those were my favorite books growing up. And I just love how they take ordinary situations and ordinary humor and make them into great storytelling. So that's my biggest hope. And I wanted to tell you also I have a day job, which is that I created Pop Tropica, which you guys have heard of. That's cool. So Pop Tropica is a virtual world. And so I'm kind of doing those two things at once and also working on the movie and hopefully movies. So there's a lot going on, but it's great to be able to take time out and meet my fans. So I can't wait to answer your questions and then to sign your books. So thank you very much for having me.
And he didn't speak for too long. He knows that these guys are not going to listen.
We will take questions from readers of all ages. And I see someone who had his hand up right there. So I don't, go ahead and stand up. A little technical problem. Everyone heard that? Question, it's a technical question, sort of. The production of the 5th book.
I think my editor sent you, right? He wants to know too. I haven't written a word of that thing, although I got a good idea for a joke. My son the other night, we now give him a half an hour of extra time, like he can stay up an extra half an hour to read, to kind of reward him and encourage him to read. But what he doesn't know is that we rolled back his bedtime by a half an hour. So he's really just going to bed at the same time, but he feels like he's getting to stay up extra late. And those are the types of jokes that'll make it into this next book. But no, it's going to be, I do know a little bit about it. It's going to be purple, right? And yes, you guys knew it. We're running out of colors, so. And it's going to heavily feature, you notice that Rowley and Greg aren't friends at the end of the last book. Well, it's going to be all about that, their friendship. Thanks for the question.
Right here, first row. Go ahead.
Did Greg Heffley actually get caught by the muddy hand? Spoiler alert. I think the muddy hand is just an imaginary thing in a movie, so no, he didn't get caught.
Right there. Go ahead. Stand up and speak out.
Can you see the fart, please? I think if somebody has an orange book, then you absolutely can, to your heart's content. There we go, lots of them. Yay. So just look at the page. Sorry, parents. Yeah.
Question from a parent back there. Go ahead.
Where did you get the idea for the cheese touch?
Where did I get the idea for the cheese touch? That's a great question. Well, there was a piece of cheese on a playground that I knew of, and I mixed it with kind of cooties. Did you have cooties back when you were growing up? Yeah. I've asked kids about that, about cooties recently, and a lot of kids don't know what it is. And I'm like, did it die? It actually died off, like tuberculosis or something, So kids don't know, but cooties is an imaginary thing that you pass from one person to the next. And I've heard that the cheese touch is causing a lot of problems on playgrounds across the nation, actually. So I'm very proud of that. What inspired me to write the books? Well, you know what? I like I said, I always liked stories from my childhood, and I thought if you collected everybody's life stories in one place and took all the funny parts, you'd have a great book. Like, I feel like everybody in here could have 10 books in it, easily, if you just write down the funny parts, or if you write down the scary parts, or the sad parts, or the happy parts, I didn't keep a journal as a kid, but I would really encourage you to do that, because you'll have something really valuable later on.
Way in the back, in the last row. Go ahead.
What was your favorite book to write?
What was my favorite book to write? That's a good question. I'll be very honest with you. Writing these books is extremely hard work. Like, it's not fun at all the way through. The fun part of it is when I get the book and I'm done with it. But generally speaking, it takes me about 4.5 hours, maybe 5 hours to write just one joke. And each joke is, there are about maybe 300 jokes per book. So it's really time consuming. But I did, I enjoy the process when I'm drawing and everything like that. So, and that's what I'm doing for the new book right now.
Question from the librarian.
I have a question. I am the YA librarian, and one of the YA librarians here. I'd like to know what were some of your favorite titles when you were growing up, and who were some of your favorite authors?
Sure. Judy Blume was, as I mentioned, Tales of a Fourth Grade Nothing and Freckle Juice. I liked Blubber too. I was a very Judy Blume kid. Let's see, Beverly Cleary, I liked her. The Ramona books and those. But then I moved on and I moved into fantasy. Piers Anthony, the Xanth series, and some others. And then J.R.R. Tolkien, who did The Hobbit and other books like that. So, yeah. Were there any books that I didn't like growing up? That's an interesting question. The only books I can remember are the ones that stuck around in my bathroom, which were, that was like, if they stuck around in there, like the Calvin and Hobbes books or The Far Side, then they had made it. And those books like really got mangled. So I can't think of any that I didn't like right off the bat.
Liam?